Hello, good morning everyone, Bridge Wong here, welcome back to the channel. Today we are looking at this new Schneider Samyang 1424f 2.8 for E mount today. This is Samyang's first ultra wide-angle zoom lens with autofocus for the Sony full-frame E mount system. This lens is created together by Samyang and the Germany optics company Schneider, which is a pretty interesting collaboration. While 14-24f 2.8 is quite a common focal length, but this lens has a few interesting design that makes it potentially a great choice for people who want an ultra wide-angle lens for their Sony cameras. I would like to thank you, the Samyang New Zealand distributor Lumix, for lending me this lens for a review, but as usual, this is a completely independent review and I'll share with you all the pros and cons I found in this video. Here is a video to show you the range of this Samyang lens, starting from the 30-N 24mm and then we zoom out all the way to the widest focal length 14mm. As you can see, 14mm is pretty wide. But having an ultra wide-angle zoom lens is not just to allow you to capture wider, but it is also a very effective tool for you to create a complete different look of the same subject. Here are two photos of the Auckland Museum, one shot at 24mm and then the other one shot at 14mm. As you can see, even though the building is roughly at the same size and position in the photo, but look at these two photos, they look very different. So a zoom lens is not just about taking a wider or tighter photo. If you use it effectively, it can help you to create some very interesting photos. The body of this Samyang lens is mostly made of plastic, but it is very nice quality plastic that doesn't feel cheap. I'm not too sure if it's intentional or not. The pattern on the focus ring and the zoom ring has a bit of that old school style that reminds me of some of the old DSLR lenses back in 1990s. There is a blue ring at the front of the lens, which is probably to tell us that this is a collaboration between Schneider and Samyang. The size of this lens is really compact for a ultra wide-angle zoom lens with f2.8 maximum aperture. The weight of this lens is only 445 grams, which is also very light. Even with the small A7CR body that I'm using to do this review, the lens doesn't feel front heavy at all. It is much lighter than the other equivalent lenses from Sony and Sigma, which are all around 800 grams or more. Both the zoom ring and the focus ring feels very smooth, much smoother than the average autofocus lenses in the market. The zoom ring has a pretty short travel that is just around 45 degrees from the wide end to the telephoto end. There's a AF/MF switch on the side of the lens and there's also a custom button next to it. There's a USB-C port at the bottom of the lens which allows you to do firmware update directly just using a USB cable. Even though the USB port is completely exposed, Samyang says this is a weatherproof lens. The lens comes with a plastic reversible, removable lens hood. Now, one thing that makes this lens really special is that this lens has a 77mm front filter thread. This is the only f2.8 ultra wide-angle zoom lens for Sony E mount that has a front filter thread. Pretty much all the other f2.8 ultra wide-angle lenses for E mount has an extruded front element, so none of them has a front filter thread. This makes this Samyang lens a really attractive choice for anyone who wants to shoot with filters, which is pretty common for landscape shooters. Okay, now let's have a look at the image quality. All the test photos and videos were shot with the 61MP Sony A7CR. All test photos were shot in RAW format and then converted to JPEG using Adobe Lightroom with default settings. Lens correction is enabled unless I state otherwise. When I'm working on this review, Adobe Lightroom doesn't have the lens profile for this lens, but Samyang has provided on their website, so you just need to download it from their website and copy it to the right folder, then your Adobe software will apply the lens profile automatically for you. I'll put a link below where you can download the lens profile and the instructions for installing it. Now let's look at the image sharpness at the wide end 14mm. The center is very sharp at f2.8. Because of that, stopping down the lens doesn't really improve the center sharpness, it only marginally improves the contrast. With the 61 megapixel Sony a7CR, the center sharpness remains really sharp until f8. After that, image becomes softer due to diffraction. Corner at f2.8 is slightly soft, but to be honest, it's still very acceptable for 61 megapixel photo. And you just need to stop down slightly to f4 and then the corner sharpness would improve quite a bit. Okay, now let's look at 24mm, the teddy end. At f2.8, the center is quite sharp, but it becomes sharper when you stop down to f4. And then center sharpness remains the same until diffraction softens the image from f8 onwards. The corner is also not bad at f2.8, but it becomes sharpest once you stop down to f5.6. The minimum focus distance is 0.18 meter and the maximum magnification ratio is 0.17 times at the wide end and 0.26 times at the teddy end, which is not bad. Shooting at the minimum focus distance, there is a tiny bit of softness at f2.8, but once you stop down to f4, then sharpness is already very good. For an ultra wide angle lens, bokeh is usually not very important. But since this lens has a f2.8 maximum aperture and it can focus quite close, so it is still possible to dissolve the background when you are shooting close-up subject. When you do that, bokeh looks not bad. It is quite smooth and reasonably round, not distracting at all. With the lens profile correction enabled, this lens has very minimal amount of vignetting at both the wide end and the teddy end. Only noticeable at wide open, but once you stop down to f4, then vignetting becomes very minimal. However, at 14mm, the JPEG that is converted from RAW file using Adobe Lightroom has a bit of negative vignetting once I stop down the lens a bit. But when I look at the camera generated JPEG, it doesn't have this issue. So it suggests the lens profile is a little bit different from the in-camera processing and it may have over-corrected vignetting a bit. As I mentioned before, the lens has a 77mm front filter thread, so you could use a normal filter very easily, which is a big selling point of this lens. But because this is an ultra wide angle lens, so you need to make sure you use a slim filter if you want to avoid introducing additional dark corner to your photos. I tested with my slim Kenko UV filter and there's almost no difference in terms of vignetting with and without the filter installed. But if you use a fake filter or stack multiple filters, then it is possible that you may introduce some additional vignetting near the edge of the photo. Now all the photos that I showed you so far are with the lens profile correction enabled in Lightroom. If I completely disable all the correction, then you will get a lot more vignetting, especially at the wide end. So I definitely recommend you to enable lens profile correction when you are shooting with this lens. This lens has very little chromatic aberration. I see very minimal amount of color fringing in my test photo and all my real world photos, even with the 61 megapixel resolution, so that is pretty impressive. My local test photo also doesn't show any noticeable color fringing. With the lens profile correction enabled, the lens has very minimal amount of distortion. Look at these two photos, shot at 14 and 24mm focal length, there's virtually no distortion. But if you disable lens profile correction, at 14mm, distortion is very noticeable. To be honest, this is not a surprise at all considering this is a 14mm ultra wide angle lens and it is very compact in size. At 24mm focal length, even without the distortion correction, there's only very minimal amount of distortion. Lens flare is a little bit complicated. Under most situations, lens flare performance is very good. there's minimal amount of lens flare and ghosting. However, when shooting at the wide end, sometimes you can see a pretty noticeable ring-shaped lens flare near the corner of the frame. This is only noticeable when there is a strong light source directly in front and only happens at around 14mm. If you zoom in the lens a bit to around 18mm, then this ring-shaped lens flare would disappear. Or stop down the lens a bit to around f4 can also minimize that. To get sunstars in your photos, you need to stop down the lens to f8 or more. Sunstars looks pretty nice and clean, so this could be a pretty nice lens if you want to capture photos with some nice looking sunstars. With the f2.8 maximum aperture, this lens could be great for astrophotography. So now let's have a look at the chroma performance. At both 14mm and 24mm, there is small amount of chroma flare at the corner at f2.8. Stopping down to f4 would improve it a lot. Autofocus speed is fast no matter you are shooting photo or video. The autofocus operation is virtually silent. Focus breathing is almost not noticeable as well. Both at 14mm and 24mm, my usual focus breathing test shows almost no sign of focus breathing. It's been a while since I last tested a Samyang lens, so honestly, I wasn't really sure what to expect going into this review. But after spending about 2 weeks testing this lens, I'm happy to say I'm genuinely impressed with its overall performance. Image quality is solid even when paired with the demanding 61MP sensor on the Sony a7CR. That said, the lens does rely quite a bit on profile corrections for distortion and vignetting. So make sure to have the lens profile correction enabled when you're shooting with this lens. But to be fair, this isn't unique to this Samyang. Many of Sony's own more expensive G Master lenses also lean heavily on software correction, especially their more compact lenses. And compact is exactly what this lens is. Now, one flaw worth pointing out is the circular lens flare that you will see at around 14mm, especially when you are shooting directly into a strong light source. Unfortunately, this is not something lens profile correction can fix. But the good news is you can reduce it by simply stopping down the aperture a bit, so it is manageable as long as you are aware of it. Aside from that, image quality holds up very well, but the real highlights of this lens for me are not just the optics. First, it has a front filter thread. That's a big deal for landscape photographers who want to use standard filter without messing around with some bulky filter adapters. Second, the size and weight are fantastic. It's way smaller and lighter than most f2.8 ultra-wide-angle zooms that I've used. Honestly, it feels more like an f4 lens in terms of handling. That makes this Samyang an ideal travel lens if you want to keep your kit light without sacrificing that ultra-wide perspective. So no, it might not be the absolute best in terms of pure image quality, but for many of us, this Samyang strikes a great balance between price, size and performance, and that to me makes it a very appealing option.